Hello, my name is Nick Mikhailov, and here's my presentation on open source. So let's dive in. So the agenda for this video, essentially I want to answer the following questions. What is open source software? Why do we use open source software? To answer that, I'll cover the benefits of OSS and some alternatives to OSS and sort of weigh our options there. And then I'm going to give some examples of open source software. I'll briefly cover some negatives of open source software that are all kind of connected to each other. And then lastly, give some potential uses for open source software and sort of give an idea of where we're using open source software today. And then finally, a quick recap and summary. So to understand what open source software is, the first thing we're going to need to do is give it definition. So the definition I have here is software with source code that anyone can modify, inspect, and enhance. And to further understand that definition of open source software, you're going to need to understand what source code is. And source code is the code that computer programmers can go into and manipulate in order to change how a software works or part of a software works. So that could be some game on your phone that is an app, or it could be Microsoft Word. Those are some examples of softwares. So then to answer why do we use open source software, the first thing I'd like to cover would be some benefits to using open source software. So the first of those that I'll be covering is control. So many people prefer open source software because they have more control over open source rather than the alternatives, which I'll cover later. In open source software, people can go in themselves and examine the code to look at it and make sure it's doing everything that they want it to do, and to make sure it's not doing anything they don't want it to do. So people can really sort of make sure that the program they're using is exactly what they want it to be, and it's running exactly how they want it to run. And they can really use this sort of software for any purpose, and it's really up to the individual how they choose to use it. Next, we'll move on to the idea of using open source software for training. So a lot of people who are trying to become better at computer programming and reading code and writing code would prefer open source software because it allows public access. So this is really evident for students. They can go into some software and study it and learn how to recreate similar software for assignments and learning purposes. And also they can share this software with others, so they can share it with their classmates and check their work, see if there's mistakes that they have, or if there's things they forgot or things they added that they don't need to. So it really allows for a lot better learning experience with open source software, and that's why lots of people prefer it for training. Next, I'll talk about security. So a big concern with open source software is that since anyone can get into it, is it really secure? And the answer is yes, because open source softwares have people who are dedicated, their job is to be dedicated to making sure that the software is running properly and that nobody's going in making counterproductive edits to the code and making the software then not work. So there's people who are dedicated to making sure that the software is secure, and that's literally just their job. They go to work and make sure that the software is running smoothly all day, and if there's issues with the software, they go in and correct it as well. And then lastly, a lot of people prefer open source software over the alternatives because of the stability. So for long-term or important projects, programmers would publicly distribute the source code, and users rely on that software for critical tasks to make sure that their tools don't disappear or fall into a state of disrepair if the code somehow gets messed up or something else, something happens to it. They have that stability knowing that people are there making sure that the code runs smoothly and that the software is working well. So then to understand further why people use open source software, we're going to cover some alternatives to open source. So the biggest alternative to open source software would be proprietary software, which is software where only the original authors can legally copy, inspect, enhance, or alter the software. And in order to use proprietary software, computers must agree, usually by signing like a license or something along those lines, or an agreement, a terms of service, that they will not do anything to the software that the software authors have not expressly allowed them to do. And so Microsoft Office is a good example of this. You essentially pay for the Office suite, and you get the different applications, and you basically open those and you run them through your operating system, and they run how they're designed to, and you can't really change that. So that's an example of proprietary software where you purchase the software, or you purchase the ability to use the software. You don't really technically own it. So then also kind of along the lines of proprietary software, we have the idea of free software and paid software. And to me, this is really evident, with apps on your smartphone. So whether you get it on Google Play or the App Store, either one, and whether it's a free ad or if it's a $1.99 ad or application, either way, you download it, and you either pay an upfront price or it's free. And basically, it's similar to the example I used before for proprietary. You get the software and it runs how it's designed to, and you don't really have any control over changing it or making it better for your personal use. You sort of just get what you get, and you get what you pay for. So now let's move into some examples of open source software. And the first, and I think most notable one, would be Linux. So Linux is an operating system, and every desktop computer uses an operating system. So whether you could have your operating system, you purchased it through Apple on your Mac laptop, or you bought Windows 10, whatever your operating system might be. Linux is another one, and it is a free software. It is an open source software that allows you to basically run your machine and use it, and use all the different things that you would use your computer for, and the operating system allows it to do that. So Linux is an example of an open source software in an operating system. Another example would be Mozilla Firefox. And Firefox was designed to provide a complete community-based alternative operating system. So rather than buying into a traditional either Windows or Mac OS, you could use Firefox as an alternative, and that's an open source software. And then similar to that, made by the same Mozilla company, is Mozilla Thunderbird, and that is essentially their email application. And since it's open source, it's constantly being improved by numerous people, and so it's constantly becoming more user friendly and more powerful, and just overall provides an easier experience for the user. And then another one that I'm sure many of us probably know about is Android. Android is an open source software as well. And some quick stats: Android devices account for about 70% of mobile units shipped out in the last quarter of 2012, which was up from only 51% in the last quarter of 2011. So that's just a quick statistic there. It is getting more popular, and that is in part due to the fact that it is open source software, as opposed to Apple's iOS system is considered a closed source operating system. But although it still does rely on many open source software components as well. So then some negatives of open source software. I have 3 of them, but they're all pretty well connected to each other. And the first I'd like to touch on is the idea of service support. So with open source software, if you run into a problem and you call people who are in charge of that particular software, and because it is an open source software, anybody can go in. You can go in and fix it yourself. So that is kind of the assumption that some of these open source software makers operate under. They are under the impression that if you have a problem with the software, you can kind of go in and fix it yourself. So the service support for some open source softwares can be a little bit lacking, and there could be a sort of feeling of neglect there, which ties in to my next point of a negative of open source software, which would be that it is not entirely user friendly. So somebody like myself who doesn't know how to read code or write code, it would be very difficult for me to be happy with an open source software if I were to have one and then run into a problem with it that I wouldn't be able to fix on my own. Let's say I'm using Mozilla Firefox, I'm on the internet, and I encounter some problem, and I personally can't go into that code and look at it and be like, what's the problem? Let me find it and fix it myself. I would have to call, and in that case, Mozilla is a good company that is pretty. They do have a lot of this service support that I said was lacking in some companies, but you could see how a consumer could have a negative experience using open source software if they didn't get the support they needed. And then lastly, that brings me to my last negative about open source software, and that is the idea that most people today don't know how to read code or write code. They don't know much about it. They kind of get the general idea of what it does, but they don't really know too much about the details of it. So overall usability for an everyday consumer, if there's no problems with the software, it's great. It works just like any other software. It works just like Windows 10 or your Mac iOS software, or operating system, sorry, or whatever it might be. But for the everyday consumer, the overall usability, if a problem occurs, could be pretty bad. And so these three negatives that I have here, service support, user friendliness, and overall usability, are all tied together on the idea that if a user doesn't know the basics or the details of code, then they could be left in a situation where they don't feel like they're getting the help that they need. So then the last thing I want to cover are some potential uses for open source software. And the biggest one would definitely be in smartphones, I think. I talked about Android earlier. Even Apple's iOS uses some OSS components. So all your applications that you download, just think about how many apps are on your phone. If you have a smartphone, it's really just a large number, and a lot of them rely on open source software so that they can be improved constantly. And that is partially why apps update so often as well. Secondly, OSS can be very useful in financial services, and this is through the idea of applications on the smartphone. I know personally I have the US Bank app on my phone since I use US Bank, and it allows me to interact with my bank and financial service provider just from my phone. I don't have to do anything. It's very easy. I just open the app, put in my password, and I'm good to go. I can do literally anything on that app that I would have been able to do at the actual bank at a physical location. So most apps in the development for mobile platforms along the lines of banking and financial services are using or open source software to create those programs and applications. And then lastly, I think the most interesting is in automobiles. So software is literally everywhere in modern cars. Today's top line cars that use open source software have more than 1 million lines of software code, which is quite a bit. And things like GPS and your internal vehicle information systems all use OSS not directly, but they used them to create them. The people who created the stuff in your car used open source software to create that, and so OSS is designed at creating an overall better user experience, and I think that is really the most important part of OSS with cars. And so lastly, to give a recap and summary, we defined what open source software was, and that definition that I gave was a software with source code that anyone can modify, inspect, and enhance. And then to further understand that, source code is the code that computer programmers go into and manipulate in order to change how a software, or at least part of it, works. And then I covered why we use OSS, and that is because of the benefits of increased control, the opportunity for computer programming training, a lot of good security goes into it, and also the stability for long-term projects with OSS is also a benefit. Also, we looked at alternatives and the parts of those that OSS is better at, and then we moved into some examples. We covered Linux briefly, Mozilla Firefox, and Mozilla Thunderbird, and also Android. And then I briefly talked about some of the negatives of OSS, and then gave some potential uses for OSS as well. And then here I have my references, and that concludes my project. Thank you.